Welcome back to another episode of Radical Narrative. I am your host, Landbased. Kind of went on hiatus there. We welcomed our second daughter, Namanaina Tatusis, into the world. So now I have two daughters. I'm back and super excited to be working on content for all y'all out there. And again, coming at you from smack dab in the middle of Treaty 6 territory, the prairies. This episode is dedicated to all of those out there who slid into our DMs and said, hey, do a podcast on hunting. So we did. We worked on this and we found a great guy who's going to come on here and talk story with us. We also have some other amazing episodes lined up with some surprise guests. Today on the podcast, I'm sitting down with Philip Brass. Philip Brass is from Peepeekisis Cree Nation in southern Saskatchewan. Philip is very aware of the prairie region and what's going on here in terms of the ecology around climate change. He's an avid hunter. He dedicates most of his time to learning and sharing the teachings of traditional land-based skills to his community in those areas. Really excited to have him on the podcast and provide a safe access point to start conversations out for all of y'all who are thinking about hunting, thinking about obtaining a rifle, and getting out there safely and ethically. Listen in as we talk about prairie life, the 100-kilometer radius food subsistence challenge, and ultimately not linking up with assholes out on the land. I really enjoyed this podcast. I'm really excited to bring it to you. So stay tuned and listen in. Philip Brass, I really wanted to sit down with you to talk about prairie life and hunting and the work that you're doing because it stands out to me. We never formally met, but I do have you on my social media accounts and I follow you and I love what I'm seeing. So I really want to sit down today and have a conversation around not only what you do, but also hunting and providing an access point to our listeners to sort of start to engage and be mindful of obtaining that practice again.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So tell us about yourself. Who are you? Where do you come from? And what do you do?
Well, that's always one difficult question to answer. I don't know where to begin. It gets harder the older I get. Yeah. So it's a long and very unconventional story. Presently live on Peepeekisis Cree Nation here in Treaty 4 territory, just east of Fort Capel. This is the community that my late father, Dr. Oliver Brass, was from, and I grew up here and in Regina, back and forth throughout my childhood and adolescent years, and then lived here off and on as an adult as well. So yeah, I'm middle-aged now. I don't know, I'll be 45 this year, and my wife Michelle and I have been out here for just over a decade. And we had left careers in the city. I had worked in the film and television industry for about 13 years. Mm-hmm. And Michelle had worked in journalism. She was a CBC radio host back in 2010, 2011, when we pulled the plug and left the city and came out to the reserve. I have this old house here that my mushum, my grandfather, built back in the 50s. Uh-huh. That I inherited, and we have land out here in our family. And we wanted to, build a lifestyle of independence, sort of off grid, growing our own food, harvesting our own food, really kind of preparing ourselves for, a turbulent future. Yeah. I think at the time we were in our early 30s and really becoming aware of some of the climate crisis that we face, becoming more aware of the industrial food systems in the world and their consequences. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we left our careers, came out here. Over the last decade, I really started to working as a wellness coordinator in the community back in 2012, I guess. And that's when I started working with youth in the community. My mandate wasn't with the school. It was really more gang prevention and trying to connect with some of the young men in the community who were getting themselves in trouble. And my method to connect with them was to just approach them and actually take them out hunting. Nice. And I found that it worked. And as I got to know a lot of them, it wasn't I mean, my suspicions were correct. I mean, 90% of them didn't have a father in their life, an active father in their life. They weren't being provided, traditional or cultural skills to provide them with, healthy identities and teachings.
Yeah.
And so I was really able to build some really good relationships and friendships with a lot of young people in the community by getting them out on the land with me. And it's there that I really realized too that how powerful of a teacher the land is in and of itself in correcting toxic behaviors, in really, I think, sort of breaking a person down. I think an example of that was I took a youth out who was, pretty difficult to deal with on a daily basis in the community or in the school. But, once I had him out on a big lake in northern Saskatchewan in a small boat, and he looked terrified. Really, he admitted he couldn't swim. And he was, dependent on me to keep him alive out there. And that was really what sort of opened the door to begin a transformation for him. And that's what I realized and come to value about, land-based, not just land-based education, but just land-based experience and connecting with one another and with the territories that we're from.
Yeah.
So that's led me down, that's a little offshoot of telling you about myself, but I mean, that's led me to a lot of different work. So I work in conservation as well. So I work as Indigenous advisor for the Nature Conservancy.
Nice.
And then I also work for a number of school divisions, tribal council school division, and then also a provincial school division here at Prairie Valley. Doing land-based education with both teachers and students.
Yeah, that's great. And then, like, one of the reasons why I really wanted you on this podcast was because some people reach out to me in the DMs of this podcast and say, "Hey, I love this episode. You talked about this. Can you do more about that?" And I think just in general, some of the podcast episodes we had in the past were about land-based stuff. And I had people reach out and say, "Hey, why don't you do an episode on hunting?" And obviously I hunt, obviously there's background there for that. But I didn't want to be the guy to talk about it or the person to talk about it. So I was thinking, who could I get that, has a strong political analysis, land-based practice that could be able to talk about, introducing people to hunting ultimately. And yeah, you're the guy that popped into my brain as, somebody who's doing this work. You're on social media, but you're also under the radar. And that's sort of who we look for with Radical Narrative, is people who are doing the work, but are, under the radar, actually doing the stuff, not so much out there for the mainstream audience. And yeah, that's you fit the bill. So that's why I wanted to reach out to you. And yeah, it sounds amazing. Like even just in terms of future episodes, we could definitely do some around land-based education, around, getting those young people out there onto the land and deconstructing some of that negative stuff that, goes on in their life, or those behaviors they have that need to be addressed and remedied. But I want to center hunting with you, and many, like I said, many people have asked about hunting episodes, and some of our listeners actually, said, "Hey, I want to know more about firearms and hunting." And yeah, so what type of hunting do you do out there on the prairie, or I guess, in our traditional territories, in North America?
Right. Well, I mean, I've had my hunting journey is long. I mean, I started hunting, 1983. I was like 7. And my dad was an avid hunter. As much as he could. He was an academic, so he lived in the city and he was at the university a lot. But, my weekends in my childhood were full of weekends coming to the reserve and going hunting rabbits and ruffed grouse. And then beginning to go on, some deer hunting trips, probably when I was about 8, 9 years old. And then, probably by about time when I was 8, 9, actually going on some bigger hunting excursions. By the time I was 10, I took my first deer, my first moose when I was 12. And we often did an annual sort of pilgrimage of sorts to the Cypress Hills. My late father, sort of had this practice, he'd always say, they rounded us up out of the Cypress Hills and forced us onto reserves. And it was sort of a political statement of his, to make sure that we we went back to the Cypress Hills each year, and we would hunt there, and to just keep that practice alive. So yeah, I grew up with a big connection to that place, but also here in East Central Saskatchewan, where Peepeekisis is situated here, hunting around here as well. And then, I lost my dad when I was 20, it's 24 years ago, but I continued to hunt. I mean, hunting was something I was very passionate about as a child. I was just, my mind was full of the images and experiences of being out on the land, and I just loved it. And I was also, a prolific drawer as a child, and I would draw wildlife, pictures and nature pictures. And so it really consumed my mind and my being, and it's always been, I think, really the foundation of my identity.
Totally.
So yeah, and we were diverse hunters. So, hunt waterfowl, hunt ducks, geese, hunt, like I was saying, rabbits and rough grouse. And late as I grew into an adult, I found my way to even have some opportunities to hunt other upland game birds like sharp-tailed grouse and pheasants, and I was always a big game hunter, hunting, deer, elk, moose. In recent years, I've had the opportunity to harvest a number of buffalo as well. And I guess that's really most of covers the hunting aspects of it.
Yeah, and you're talking about land-based relationships too, right? And I think that's the key factor with Indigenous hunters and subsistence hunters, is that it's an intergenerational practice, it's a multi-generational practice, and a lot of it is subsistent hunting, right? So like I think a lot of times, with just how much mainstream hunting's taking off, and there's like the wild TV channels and hunting channels, people tend to see that and view, that's what a hunter is. But we're talking about a practice here, and you're really centering that, actually going back to traditional territories and literally sustaining yourself and your diet from what you're procuring from those territories. And that, I feel like that's what, distinguishes Indigenous hunters from, what are they called? Like trophy hunters or, settlers, coming into the territory to take down a prize deer type thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, there's been a bit of an evolution there as I've grown older and more conscious of that difference. And I do it with much more intention than I do or would have as a younger man. I put myself to a challenge here several years back to have like a 100-kilometer diet. So everything I hunted had to be like within a 100-mile radius or 100-kilometer radius of my house.
Yeah.
And so I haven't hunted in Cypress Hills actually since 2010. Really because I was trying to divest myself from this whole sort of fossil fuel dependence of, long range travel for, our food procurement. And I was like, what can I harvest, on the reserve itself, and like, could I keep our freezer full with food I harvest on reserve or within really close proximity? And then, or going up and I set fish nets as well. So I go up near Fishing Lake, which is about an hour and a half north. I'd like to fish more locally here in the valley, but the water is a disaster down there. Yeah. We don't eat the fish out of there, which has had huge impacts on our community, right, and the culture and the food culture of our community, by losing that food and that fishing culture in our community.
Yeah, there's so much we could talk about that, and it's like there's a lot of overlap you're talking about just in terms of how I view the world and how I feel like Indigenous people are starting to view the world critically through the lens of climate change, through the lens of fossil fuel, diet, and access to food systems, and ultimately food sovereignty. And this 100-kilometer diet sounds really cool. How did that work, and how did that unfold ultimately? Would you define it as a success?
Yeah, well, for me, it's been a success, I guess. Because I know my area and my territory very well, right? I've put a lot of years into knowing where to go, how to get there, and who to connect with in order to make these things happen. I wouldn't have been able to do that 20 years ago. I wouldn't have had the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So it took, that's the thing about hunting it's progressional. It's a cumulative knowledge that takes years and decades to get to a point of being really, really efficient, and doing it in a way that's, I think, intentional, respectful. All of that, it takes time. It takes time and experience. It's really experiential knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And there's a big learning curve there too, huh? For people to, I feel like when I have well, let me talk about archery, for example. Is like, I guess I'm an archer. I do make bows and arrows and I shoot a lot, but people always come up to me and want like a bow and they ask for like the end product. And for me, it's really challenging to say, okay, well, if you want a traditional bow, here's the process that goes into it, and sort of given that backstory. And there's a big learning curve with a lot of these practices, and even with hunting too, right? So it's like, how do we explain people and provide an access point for them to, start that journey in a meaningful way, and start that journey where, ultimately that journey is not going to end. People are going to keep developing, keep learning, and a lot goes into establishing and creating the practice. And ultimately, at the end, you do gain wisdom, but you're never fully, completely finished. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's a never-ending journey of learning, right? I mean, I've learned more, and my skills have grown exponentially in the last 6 years than they have in the prior 15 years to that.
Yeah.
I find there's kind of these sort of plateaus you might sort of level out. And, it depends on how active and how, if you actually choose to become a subsistence hunter and really are hunting on that sort of level and that often, your skills will really grow quite quickly. If hunting is just sort of a one-time event annually, you'll stagnate, right? Your skills will stagnate at that. So yeah, it takes a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, it totally does. And that learning curve is really big. And I think it's too big for some people, because when they see it and they hear about it, I mean, like for me, one of my big critiques of, I guess like modern hunting culture is the price point, right? Because every reserve out there, I think in Western Canada, probably has like a 303 British that's been recycled in the community for like close to 100 years, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because that rifle's been around. It obviously has a history. I even talked to friends from New Zealand and Australia who said those have been around even in the Commonwealth. But the fact is that at that time in our history, that was the only rifle people could, have access to, or that people could afford. It's very expensive to buy a rifle. And I think like people tend to assume this price point is really high. And it is if you want to get like, quality stuff. But a lot of that isn't needed. Like it's not necessary. It is, expensive to get somebody out there into the middle of nowhere in terms of gas and having a reliable vehicle. But the big critique there is that the price point of getting somebody out on the land is high these days. And I think a lot of people think it's high, like they think it's high. But that's my big critique of it, is that, well, how do we scale this down to get people out there in a meaningful, safe way that's practical? Like you don't need all the expensive gear, but you do want safe gear, right? Because I think I decommissioned a 303 British just because it wasn't safe at all, because it's been like in my family for like 80 years. So like that type of conversation I want to have and foster, because that learning curve is big. But what is the starting point? Like what's a great starting point for an individual or even like a small family to begin the process to want to learn to hunt? And even, I guess, like even scaling it back further, wanting to learn how to shoot or even, get a rifle.
Yeah. Well, first off, I got to admit my own privilege. I have a lot of privilege that introduced me to the hunting world. I had a very loving father who was an educator and who had skills and taught me from a very young age. And he had nephews. I had older cousins that were all hunters. There's a lot of hunters in my family growing up. So I never had to put much effort into it as a child, right? I was just surrounded by it. So, it was like learning a language as a child. It's just there. To enter in as a young adult, I'm not too sure exactly what that journey's like. I mean, I've seen that, I have a number of younger cousins who who started hunting in their like late 20s, early 30s, and I take them out. I think the biggest challenge for them is sort of this, lifestyle change, right? Like they can't seem to, unplug from their fast-paced urban lifestyles in order to really to do it, or to do it well. Like they always want to come out like on Friday evening after work, and then they're like, yeah, I got to be home at like noon on Sunday. I'm like, well, you're not putting in enough time into this activity, right?
Yeah, and I do feel like that is a big clash of paradigms that we're going through today as Indigenous people, because the Western timeline and concept of time is really different. You know, capitalism and industrial time, working 9 to 5, 5 days a week, and having summers off and weekends off. That doesn't really sit well with wanting to pick up these practices, because again, like, it's a 24/7, you know, constant mindful practice to be a hunter, or to, you know, maintain any sort of land-based cultural practice. It's not just like a weekend one-stop type thing. And also, I feel like mainstream hunting culture is really whitewashed. You know, the Cabela's culture, the hunting channel culture, the trophy hunters. And I feel like a lot of young people are getting influenced by that too, is they're seeing that and they're thinking, oh, I want to be a big game trophy hunter. And it doesn't work like that either. You know what I mean?
I've always found these, you know, these hunting channels and all, you know, this new sort of, I mean, the Cabela's comes into our cities, and I see young First Nations hunters who are, you know, you can even find them on social media with, like, you know, they're doing the trophy hunting thing, right? They're showing off their big moose, their big elk. You know, they're posing with their trophies, and it's, you know, it's really not reflective of our culture and who we are as Indigenous peoples, and our relationships and our duties and responsibilities to our animal relatives. And, you know, that has big consequences in a lot of ways, right? It's not just consequences for us socially and culturally, but it has, you know, really detrimental impacts on the land and animals as well.
Yeah, and I really like how, you know, all through our conversations, you always talk about mindfulness, and that we have to be mindful that, you know, that these animals are kin to us, that there is a relationship to them, and that there are spiritual practices tied to them, and that, you know, Creator is always watching, you know, is something I always like to say now these days. So we have to be really mindful of our relationship to the animals and doing things in a good way. So my question would be, how do we counter that then? If somebody wants to learn these skills in a good way, in a good, meaningful way, how do they go about doing that?
You know, to build those sorts of skills, I mean, I think you have to be cautious of who you want to learn from. Like, you know, and that's one thing, like, as an adult sort of life learner, you know, through a critical lens, is to, you know, assess who do you want to learn from, you know, who do you admire, whose values do you admire, and what do they have to offer? Because there's a lot of guys out there with awful practices. I mean, that's the other trouble I had in the community here. Like, for instance, we'd have community hunts that I had to organize as the wellness coordinator and sport and rec guy. I had to organize band hunts. And for years, I guess, prior to me being there, they had like this $500 prize for the biggest rack. So guys were going out there and trophy hunting. And we had a butcher in the community who's a local guy. And he says, you know, half this meat that's coming in, I can't even process it. It's, you know, they're bringing in animals frozen and not even gutted or not even skinned. They're just disasters, right? He had a moose come in, it was gutted, but there was a can of blue paint spilled all over the inside of it. It was just a mess from the messy back of a truck. And so when I came in, I was like, okay, that all ends now. And now there's a $500 prize for the cleanest meat. And, you know, so this huge shift, and you realize that there was a few guys in the community that were able to come in with really clean meat. And then there was also a whole bunch of guys who weren't even capable of doing it because they didn't have the skills to do it. So it weeded out the you know, the sort of bad apples, I guess, about, you know, guys who just, you know, were sloppy. And they also weren't safe. They weren't safe to send, you know, women or children or youth with them. Right. And so, you know, finding those teachers, you know, guys who have hunting skills, you know, are they going to be good instructors? Are they going to teach you good habits? Are they going to go out there and get you in trouble or put you in danger? It's a challenge. My advice to people is, you know, seek out your teachers, you know, wisely. And for me, you know, I really look at hunting as a duty. It's a sacred duty as Indigenous peoples. We have ancient treaties and responsibilities to hunt. We were instructed to hunt our four-legged relatives, and we have to maintain that. We have to fulfill our ecological role in the ecosystems that our cultures emerged from. And so our hunting is a central component to that. So it too is ceremony. It's a sacred duty and responsibility. And so it's to be undertaken in that sort of manner. And so, you have to walk that fine line too of being ethical in what you do out there and being conscious of conservation. I mean, our ecosystems are fractured, and in many cases, especially down south here, I mean, for the most part, they're the most obliterated ecosystem on the planet. The wildlife can't sustain everybody to hunt at a level that's going to feed us year round. It's a sad reality. It's not the fault of our people. It's the fault of industrial civilization that's built this matrix around us. But we still have to, we have to live within the carrying capacity of what our environment's going to provide us with. So, yeah, learning from good instructors is really key.
Yeah, that's a really good starting point, is just to find the mentor, finding that person who's safe, because not everybody's safe to go out with, and that there's really core truth to that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's something I want to explore in future podcasts around, land-based practice and how do we, create safe spaces for everybody to be out there. One key question I had from a guest was, what type of rifle should I get? And obviously we're talking about hunting rifles. We're talking about a bolt action rifle, most likely. But they were specifically asking what type of caliber, what type of round should they get and utilize. And for our audience who isn't familiar, basically a caliber is the size of the bullet that will fit into the rifle barrel. Somebody out there could probably explain it better, more scientifically than me, but it's basically the bullet that you're going to be utilizing. And there are different types, there's different varieties, different sizes. But for the most common hunting rifle, and this question is for you, Philip, what type of calibers do you recommend people get proficient in and utilize?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suggest, really sticking to some basic calibers. I mean, I know there's all kinds of fancy calibers out there on the market now. I've owned hundreds of guns in my life. I really only kind of maintain about 10. I don't know, maybe 10 or a dozen, which even that's too many. But my all-time all-around favorite is just a 30-06. And I used a 303 for years. That's what my late dad and them all used. I grew up shooting a 303. Yeah. The ammo for 303 is expensive now. A 30-06 is really good all around gun. I think it's better than a 270. I see a lot of guys lose animals to it with a 270. 270 is really a deer rifle. Yeah. So yeah, a 30-06, and a 30-06 loves 165 grain bullets. You can buy 180s, you can buy 150s, but 30-06 likes 165s. And I recommend that for men or larger framed people. Most ideal rifle for a woman, I feel, is a 7mm .8. And I've tested out all kinds, and that's kind of my conclusion. A 7mm Magnum is a great gun too. It was my favorite for a long time as well. Get a little bit more distance out of it for large game. Yeah. And other good ones are in an old 308. So yeah, I don't recommend getting too fancy into, like, there's lots of guys buying things like 6.5 Creedmoor and blah, blah, blah. But it's all unnecessary stuff.
Yeah, and why is it important to be critical of, the mainstream hunting culture and how they're pushing like these rounds and this culture around getting the best gear, the top gear, all your camo gear has to match type stuff. Why do we got to be critical of that? Because when I look at that and I see like all these hunters decked out, I remember, my cousin who's a hunter in northern BC just going out in jeans and a flannel jacket, right? So like, why do we need to be critical of what's sort of being marketed to the hunting community?
Price point and economy. Like the same reasons for the 100-kilometer diet, right? I mean, like most of our people can't afford to take some extravagant holiday to go hunt caribou up north or something, right? I mean, hunting happens in this passive, like I grew up here on the reserve. It's like, well, we'd shoot a deer on our way to town.
Yeah.
Got to check the mail.
Yeah.
We'd shoot a deer on the way and come home unexpectedly with a deer. That's how hunting happened.
Yeah.
And it's how it has to happen for people who don't have a lot of, economic means. They don't have the time and the money to make an extra trip. So that's too why I really have a strong belief in conservation or maintaining public lands, or building those relationships with farmers and whoever who might be friendly and allow Indigenous hunters to harvest on private land, because we need to be able to do it locally, right?
Yeah, and I really like how you're articulating this need to be practical with the approach of hunting. And I always tell people to do it safely, and we'll talk about a bit more of that later. And it does suck that we have to ask for permission to enter some lands, but I always encourage people to do it safely and securely, so you don't have to cut any corners. And we'll talk about that. I'll ask another question around that in particular. But to sum it up, ultimately, it sounds like you're saying, get one good solid caliber and use that.
So yeah, starting with a simple common caliber where you can buy a lot of cheap ammo. The other thing too is I recommend anybody trying to get into it, buy themselves a 22.
Yeah, and for our listeners who aren't familiar, a 22 is a really small caliber. It's a very little round. I learned how to shoot on a 22. You can buy tons of ammo for cheap and just get in the habit of putting rounds down range and getting used to how a rifle works for very little cost. I
always get a semi-automatic 22. Learn how to install a scope, learn how to set a scope, do a lot of shooting, do a lot of target shooting, learning how to use a scope. I also recommend buying rifles that have both iron sights and a scope.
Yeah.
I've been out in the field hunting in remote places and my scope has come loose and it's all messed up. And it's like, well, take it off and you're just going to have to use your iron sights. But a lot of guns today don't even have the iron sights. So you want kind of versatility, and I always recommend, shooting a lot in the off season. Mm-hmm. You need to be a very proficient shot in order to be out there and do things ethically, right? Yeah. And for instance, I used to try to take a lot of long shots when I was younger, and I think it was really an ego thing. I've kind of stopped doing that. That's how you wound and lose animals, right? So, most everything I shoot now is within 200 yards. I'll take my rifle out and I'll shoot my rifle out to 500 and 600 yards. I know I can shoot that far, but it's just not an ethical thing to be doing on animals, especially unless, if you're new, right?
Totally.
So yeah, ethics are a big thing for me. Be responsible. Shooting an animal and taking, life is no small thing. You want to be able to do it well, do it cleanly, do it fast. So, make sure you have the skills to do it. So you have to shoot a lot. It's like a hockey player. A hockey player's got to go and shoot thousands of pucks if you're going to play at some high level, right? Mm-hmm. Hunting needs to be doing the same thing. And then that's why 22s are great, right? You can't, rifle bullets are expensive, but you can shoot thousands of rounds of 22.
Yeah.
It's getting used to that, squeezing the trigger, learning good form, getting rid of flinches, becoming a really proficient shooter, and in different scenarios, not just shooting from a bench, but shooting standing, shooting crouching. Trying distances and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the fundamental access point for people today, is if they definitely want to get into hunting, in the long run, they definitely need to start putting, some rounds down range just to get the flow going. And then, practicing firearm safety. There's courses out there. You do legally need a PAL in Canada to get a rifle. And I always tell guys and young people, they should just do that. They should just do that, because we always have run-ins with game wardens who are assholes and out there to hunt Indigenous hunters, so to speak. And we could have a whole podcast episode around settler colonialism and how they legally control our land through that. But, the safest way is to get that guns license and that rifle license and be able to buy a safe quality rifle and do so legally. And, save yourself a headache of having to run into, a racist game warden or somebody out there who may not understand treaty rights and, who may be racist.
Yeah. Well, you got to do what you got to do. We can complain all day about it, but Yeah, I mean, I got mine. I can't even remember it so many years ago. Still the same process. I mean, I know you can find different places you hear about. Like I know there was a guy who'd come to our health center here a few years back and was providing the course. Cabela's will have the course. It can be tricky trying to find them. Like they're really elusive, right? Speaking of like, sort of white privilege and things coveted by circles of white society is that whole aspect of firearms training. Like there's no Indigenous firearms trainers. And I had looked into doing it about, 5 years ago. And I finally was able to actually get a meeting with the chief firearms officer in Regina and told him that I wanted to do that because I was like, I would, at the time I was thinking I should go to all the bands in Saskatchewan, provide, PAL courses also with, I would add to it and to be like, here's your rights as well. Do you understand what your treaties say, what your status rights give you, what, just all the legalities, right? And then also knowing, what land can you hunt on? What is wildlife lands versus, nature conservancy lands versus other crown lands and, Ducks Unlimited lands. What are all these things? Because I think a lot of our young people don't know even where to go.
Yeah.
On how to not get in trouble. What's legal? What's not legal? But also to provide also, a component of ethics and, duties and responsibilities that are culturally appropriate. I think that's really important to maintain that and try to steer a lot of our young people away from that sort of, say Muniao style of trophy hunting, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's definitely like, it's challenging for young people to find those access points, even just to get the gun license, the PAL license, and even just to train, right? Like I've been talking to our local chief and council and other guys in the area of just wanting to create a designated shooting site where, these young people could go shoot safely. Because they did do an initiative to take kids out hunting, taught them to shoot. I think some did get their PAL, but they don't have a place to shoot now, so it's just kind of like, I don't feel safe with, nieces and nephews out there, just doing target shooting because, we obviously live in a settler colonial society. And it's almost like you said, there is this like whitewashing and control over firearms. And it's almost like taboo to be an Indigenous person who knows about and utilizes firearms in some of these circles because we are criminalized and stereotyped.
Mm-hmm.
And then one key element too that you're highlighting and talking about is obviously, you said I know your wife shoots too, and that your family is really involved in this practice. But how do you involve your family and make it family safe and child safe with hunting and your land-based practice?
Right. Well, for us, it's a new thing since COVID, because prior to COVID, my wife didn't hunt. I would go off with my different friends of mine and hunt every year, but she didn't hunt. I think she'd been on 1 or 2 hunting trips with me, sort of riding around. But last year, we were staying isolated. I wasn't connecting with anybody. So it just sort of happened haphazardly where my son had he's got like a little Red Ryder BB gun, and we went camping in Cypress Hills. It would have been last July. And we had the whole park to ourselves. There was absolutely nobody there because of COVID. And we were there for a week, and we were shooting, empty pop cans with my son's BB gun, my son and I. And I was trying to get my wife to try it. And she was shy at first, right? She was a little bit shy about trying. I think she was a little self-conscious and, a little bit afraid that, she wouldn't be able to do it. But she started doing it. She was really good. Actually, she was picking off, these cans just as far as I was picking them off at like 25 yards with this little tiny BB gun. And so, that kind of lit her up, and she was excited and she had a lot of fun. And I saw how much fun she had. And her birthday was coming up. So the following month, I think it was August 25th. And so I bought her a rifle. I bought and I didn't expect her to become the hunter that she's become. But I bought her this rifle, and something small, didn't have a lot of recoil. Bought her a little 7.62 by 39 bolt action rifle. So it's the same rifle as an SKS, right? Same bullet, but
same bullet, yeah.
In a bolt action form. Really nice little rifle. And gave that to her for her birthday, August 25th. And then following week after that, we spent going out, kind of having these little date nights and shooting targets. And I just ran her through a whole bunch of different hunting scenarios, and shooting different distances. And because I had, so many rounds of cheap, old military rounds for that, she was able to shoot, several hundred rounds that week.
Yeah.
And by the end of the week, it was August 29th or 30th or something. It's right at the end there. And I said, let's go hunting. Let's go over here by these lands by Ochapway. Said I'd hunt elk a lot down there. So the three of us, our son Forrest, who was 8 at the time, came with us. We drove down there. It's just like, I don't know, maybe a 70-minute drive from our house, and across the Capel Valley. And it's the eastern Capel Valley there. The valley's deeper there. There's a lot of bush, and there's a lot of finger coulees that branch off there, and it holds a lot of elk in that area. And there's some nature conservancy land there, and which is foot access only. So we parked and we walked in, and it was a baled field, and we walked for I don't know, maybe 5 minutes. Like we only made it 600-700 yards from the vehicle, and we sat down at a round bale on the edge of not too far from the edge of the bush that dropped into a coulee, and I let out one bugle, and within about 30 seconds, crunch, 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 out walks a nice 5x5 bull elk. Nice. And stands broadside in front of my wife at 40 yards. Yeah. So it's the easiest elk hunt trip I've ever had in my life. And I just told her, go ahead. So she brought him down right there. Wow. And she's been hooked ever since.
Yeah, totally. Nice.
Yeah. It was in our, of course, our son was there to watch his mom do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. So, and really, for her, she really, lights up at, food skills too. I mean, she has her own journey around, food consciousness and food sovereignty. So she really took to, learning, skinning and gutting and packing it out. She was really excited to do that all on her own, which too, like we're a little bit of, I don't use quads. I totally divested from using quads, and I really believe in a high ethical standard because I know just how damaged our ecosystems are.
Yeah.
I really try to divest as much from fossil fuel activity as much as I can. So we do a lot of walking. I pack my meat out on my back, or I have a small little cart I bought at Cabela's. It's like, one of those elk cart things. Mm-hmm. It's like it's got bike tires on it. Mm-hmm. So you can cart out a lot of meat on those. So yeah, she started hunting. And then the next month after that, in October, she was able to bring a moose down. And in November, she was able to get a nice white-tailed buck. So yeah, she had this grand slam hunting season for her first year out, which was usually pretty unheard of.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. And yeah, just for you to have that foundation for your family to pick up this practice and, get the food in the freezer and sustain yourself, that's amazing. That's great.
Yeah. And feeding a lot of people, right? I mean, so, it gets spread pretty far and wide.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I guess for our younger listener out there, like younger people who, may not have the family that hunts or may not have the access points that we had and we're talking about. I mean, for sure, definitely go about, getting a guns license. And I think there's even like a hunter safety course. You could learn a lot, from those, get that foundation to keep yourself legally safe. But how do you recommend them about going to start a small subsistence hunting project? I know you talked about the 22, you talked about the BB gun and just getting proficient in that. But let's say like somebody wants to go out there and get that rabbit or even snare the rabbit and, get that meat into their family system.
Yeah. Well, food ultimately is about community, right? I mean, it is about networks of connecting with knowledgeable people. I'm always learning as I go. I mean, I'm really learning now how to tan hides, right? And I've only been really learning how to do that over just the last couple of years. I didn't have that skill for a lot of years, and I wasted a lot of hides and left them laying on the ground in the bush. Mm-hmm. And so did my dad. That was a skill that was lost in my family for a long time. But I'm purposely, seeking out and finding people to teach me how to do that again. So yeah, I mean, we live in this amazing time where we can connect. You and I connect, and we've never met in person. Seek out people who have knowledge, because you have to be shown, right? You got to be shown. I mean, and we also, and if you can't be shown, I mean, there's lots of stuff you can learn on YouTube. I mean, I've learned all kinds of stuff on YouTube, watching tutorials. Because before you start going out there and taking life, you got to know how to process these animals, right? You got to know how to treat them with respect and make sure that you're going to get all the food value out of that animal in a good way. And there's cultural protocols too. If people are interested in that aspect as well, right? I mean, there's teachings about certain things that you do when you take certain animals, right? It's important to try to implement that stuff as you go along, but I also don't want it to restrict people from entering. But prepare yourselves well. Take it seriously, because it's a dynamic activity, right? It involves knowing your weapon very well. Being very proficient in utilizing it, but then also knowing your tools that you're going to use. You're going to need, your knives. You're going to need your saws. You're going to need maybe ropes. You're going to need your whatever you're going to, pack meat out of. For instance, you had mentioned, like, I was training last year running hills. Like I was running up the hill in the Capel Valley. I did that like 240 times, but I started, doing that because I was training my body for hunting, for packing meat out of the bush, because I had made that conscious decision some years ago to stop using quads and stop using trucks, and to just use my body, my own human strength to pack my meat out. Because it was an ethical choice to do so. So I wanted to train my body in order to maintain it. Because as I was aging, right? When you hit 40, you get there, you're going to notice all of a sudden you're like, whammo, your body wants to get weak and slow down. So I was like, I need to train my body in order to do the work I needed to do every fall. And so I was carrying I got to the point where I was carrying 105 pounds in a backpack, and I would, trudge up the hill out of the Capel Valley because, I'm just training for carrying a moose leg on my back. Right. And you want to do that activity that's going to give your muscles replicate the exact activity you want to do. Totally. You're not going to be able to do that in a gym. So yeah, I recommend people stay in shape. If you want to be a good hunter, you want to be fit. It's a lifestyle. It's a year-round lifestyle. Even though we do just most of that hunting in the fall and winter, it's year-round preparation and maintenance, right? So staying physically fit. Choosing. I say keep it simple. Like, buy yourself one rifle and use it all the time, and get really like one hunting rifle, maybe a 22, and get yourself a shotgun. Something like for rabbits, it's kind of funny. A lot of people, like, we grew up on the reserve, and we'd shoot 22s hunting rabbits, but shooting rabbits, like bush rabbits, not jackrabbits, but bush rabbits running around in the bush, they're fast, and you only get glimpses of them. If you're going to shoot them at a 22, you have to be a really proficient shooter. Beginners can't shoot rabbits with 22s. And 22s can be dangerous in the bush, especially if you have a lot of people. They ricochet. The most ideal little shotgun for a rabbit is a 410 shotgun, a small, slender shotgun shell. Problem with them, though, is that they don't manufacture any non-toxic shot for a 410. You only have lead shot, which really sucks. So the next best thing is a 20 gauge. It's got a 20 gauge shotgun. So that's what I use now. I use a 20 gauge shotgun for all my upland game birds and rabbits, because I want to use steel shot. Yeah. My wife was always harping on me because I'd always buy the cheap lead shot, because you'd buy tons of it for cheap. Yeah. But then, you don't get your rabbit peppered full of lead shot, right? And then, learning how to snare is great, but I mean, it's a lot of work. It is. And you're going back, if you have the time to do it, it's great. And it's going to be different in different places, right? Like, there's different, it depends where you live, like here, I live down in the southern prairie. I mean, it's like farmland with little round slough bushes that aren't very big. They're tiny little bushes. They're often in like an oval shape. and they're really easy to hunt, right? They're really easy to hunt. But if you're living in a place that's got larger, square mile of forest, I mean, it's a totally different game, right? So there's going to be, I don't know how to hunt in those places. I don't know how to hunt rabbits in that type of place, right? You kind of get to know your own backyard, right?
Yeah, totally. There's lots to think about, and I like how you're presenting like this framework that is allowing, even for me, just to be more mindful of my hunting practice and things like that. Like even with the lead shot, right? I remember reading articles on it like a couple of years ago, and me moving away from that too in terms of the animals I'm taking, because it leaches, right, and even gets into the ground, right, and things like that. Like taking into account those ethical considerations, cultural considerations, even spiritual considerations, right? Because I mean, depending on who your people are, there's definitely going to be those types of considerations that come into play with your hunting practice and land-based practice and things like that. So I think one key thing I'm taking away from you is definitely being mindful and being ethical. And that's what I wanted to foster around the hunting conversations, because I mean, like you said, there's a lot of unsafe people out there. There's assholes out there who are proclaiming themselves as hunters, but really they're not ethically and culturally sound people to begin to do that practice in a meaningful, sustainable way.
Yeah, and it's ever more important as we face a climate crisis, and our animal relatives are under so much pressure. I think we have to think deeply about our own practices, because we want them to be sustainable, right?
Yeah.
And we're, I wish we were living in a time and place where our ecosystems were intact and thriving and teeming with the animals that our ancestors were able to hunt, mm-hmm. and they didn't have to think as deeply about these really difficult ethical questions of self-control.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, the population makes a big difference, right? So it's not something about trying to, because some people will, I run into some of our people and they'll have bad attitudes. They're like, yeah, who cares? I don't care what, the white hunters think of us, or, it's my right. I can shoot 5 moose if I want. Right. And that's the other thing too, is I know there's a lot of young hunters out there, and I've seen this happen. There were some young guys here from File Hills a few years back, and they went up north of here about a half-hour drive, and, they saw 5 moose standing in the field. So they shot all 5. Mm-hmm. 1 bull and 4, I think 2 cows with 2 calves, right? Just, wiped out the whole pile there. Wow. And they didn't have the means to skin and gut and get all that meat home. Yeah. So they left 3 of them in the field.
Wow.
And that's what I cringe at, because I know a lot of our young people aren't getting those ethical teachings, right? Mm-hmm. Or any consciousness around conservation. It's really easy to squeeze the trigger. I've even seen older hunters do it, right? Yeah. There's a lack of respect there, and there's a lack of disconnect from the reality of what are you going to do with that meat? And do you have even the stamina that day to do the work, right? Yeah. Sometimes you gotta let an animal go if it's just, being smart about, what's responsible and what's not, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had conversations with some young guys out here too around. I'd noticed them rushing a lot, like they rush a lot in the hunting practice, and part of it too was a weekend hunting. But then I was trying to really pinpoint, how come these guys rush, and how come they're even just how they're cleaning the animal, they were just rushing, and I was like, you guys, we just need to chill out, like take your time. And I think part of it was just a learned behavior, and of that's how they seen things done, and they didn't want to get busted or caught. And that's why I always tell, young people, do it legally. Like go find the land. It sucks that we have to find, safe places to hunt, but at least you're not rushing. Like at least you're not sneaking around and attracting heat. And I always tell people to take their time and be patient with this practice when you go out, and get your kit ready and be ready to dedicate time to it. Because like I noticed that too, is it's almost like a learned behavior of hunting in secret or rushing to get in and get out, I find.
Absolutely. I've thought about that a lot, right? Like there's a lot of practices that, we've been criminalized on our own land and our own territory, right? Because we're surrounded by private property. Mm-hmm. And so we've had to, under the Crown's laws, we've had to poach to survive for generations. And, when you do that for generations, practices develop and emerge that are just reflective of that danger and that need to be sneaky and to get in and get out type of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a major caveat with this conversation we're having, because as Indigenous people, we do have more of a right to hunt than settlers do out there. But I think we're just having a conversation here on how to get people out there safely and effectively, because we don't want people to get into any sort of predicament that, leads to some chaos for them. And we want to keep people safe for the times we're living in. And I like how you were willing to have these conversations and are willing to have these conversations in communities with young Indigenous hunters and Indigenous hunters in general, on how we foster our autonomy, our right to hunt, and ultimately become strong again to be able to do things effectively, smoothly, and freely.
Yeah, we need to address that. And that's why we need Indigenous hunters to be conscious and cognitive of the conservation equation, relationships with non-Indigenous peoples. I think we have to kind of reclaim our power and but also engage in a way that is going to create some systemic change out there on the land for our future generations, for our young people, because we can't continue to have to do things, below the radar and trying to hunt in a way that we could be criminalized.
Yeah. And we are ethical. I think that's the key thing too, as affirming, these young hunters, that they're fulfilling a role. They are ethical. Sure, they need to smooth out some things here and there, but I really foster like them procuring the wisdom and even the confidence to know that, hey, we're hunting in season and everything's legal, but if there was a situation where we did have to procure meat, or if there was a situation where we had to survive out there, we could. There's a confidence in that. But for now, let's just, make sure that we're doing things safely and securely, so we're not cutting any corners in this practice.
Yeah. Well, and I also, the thing about hunting, I wrestle with this, right? Because, sometimes thinking about this sort of like preparing for the unstable future, or a collapse of industrial civilization, and this sort of notion of, can we feed ourselves? I even myself, after a lifetime of hunting, I don't know if I could, because, my hunting still relies upon access to replenishment of ammunition.
Yeah.
And, I shoot bows, but I shoot bows I buy. I don't know how to, as of yet, make a bow from scratch. Yeah. And even if I did, I don't know how successful I'd be in actually being able to feed myself. So I sometimes, it's a bit of a reality check, right? It's a bit of a privilege. It's a bit of I know we're still very dependent on an industrial civilization in order to give us what we have in order to hunt. I'm always searching, and I'm always looking for, like, okay, well, how close can I get, at least, right? Even if it's not all the way, but like, that's why I am making those steps towards bow hunting, right? I'm like, okay, well, at least I want to be able to take that step and get away from rifles. But it's a progressional thing, right? Yeah. Like it may be tough to just, to just start with bows first and never hunt with rifles. Although I don't know, I've never taken that path.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And even for me with like my archery, I ensure that we get food security. So my first primary hunt is always a rifle hunt. So I'm always like centered on wanting to get that meat first and foremost, and then I'll go out with a bow later. And it's not always successful at all. Like, I'm still learning so much about it. But for the most part, I'm pretty confident with where I'm at right now. And again, it sounds like, setting those goals is really important. And I do want to set more goals for myself. And I'm not an expert. Like, every mindful land-based practitioner I talk to always position themselves as not being an expert. And I think that's something we have to keep fostering, because we're always learning. And you're saying it yourself, you're always learning, you're growing, you're challenging yourself. The goalpost always changes and it's always moving. Like there's no final end destination in in our relationship to our land. There's always something new to learn, especially in these times, and especially in the times of, coming out of the wake of colonization and colonialism.
Yeah. What I'd love to see is I'd really love to see like us get a little bit more organized as young Indigenous peoples. And I mean, like in Saskatchewan, non-Indigenous hunters have like the Wildlife Federation, for instance, right? Or Ducks Unlimited, right? You got a lot of hunters with resources, money, where they pool their monies, and they're purchasing lands. They're doing some good work around conservation. But I would love us to take the bull by the horns and be doing the same thing in our own communities, and not just within our own communities, but really reconnecting across our entire territories and sharing resources, sharing knowledge, building networks where we could start providing firearms courses, different training programs, building our own rifle and archery ranges, having our own programs for youth and camps. And ultimately it'd be great if we're able to work in conservation in protecting lands, whether that's something that might be entirely different from bands buying TLE land, but something that I think as hunters we have to be really proactive in that, because there's a lot of competition going forward in the next couple of decades around land use and access. There's a lot of pressures, global pressures.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think we can't take it for granted, and I think that we can't afford to remain disconnected and unorganized.
Yeah, I really love the calls to organize and mobilize, people who are connected to the land through hunting. And it's going to require work. I always feel like as Indigenous people, we have to do more than what settlers are doing. Because you're right to say that, Ducks Unlimited, I know they cause a lot of problems with, Indigenous hunters in the north. And I think they technically own the most land or something like that. They legally technically own the most land. So when people talk about land back, they're thinking about Canada, but really we should be looking at Ducks Unlimited, this conservation paradigm that's procuring these lands and legally controlling them, but they're more organized than us. That's the reality. That's the fact, right? And that's why I feel like I want to take a step away from fostering a style of hunting and land-based practice that exists in secrecy, that exists in fear. And really just openly having positive, healthy conversations around, no, we have a right to hunt. You have a right to utilize a rifle. You have a right to learn how to, get that meat out there ethically. And we should just have open, honest conversations about these practices and create those safe access points. And it sounds like you're doing that. It sounds like you're really doing that with the youth you're working with, your family. And I wanted to have a healthy, positive conversation around this stuff. No machismo, because, that's also another thing that comes out with these practices. People telling you to do it right, people saying you're doing it wrong, and a big ego stroke. And I guess we could even have a little short conversation about that is like, for me, I always tell people to get the wisdom in the practice, like actually get out there and put rounds down range, put arrows down range, because you're getting the wisdom in the practice and actually doing the task and dedicating time to that task accumulates that wisdom. So make sure people, like, you're actually doing the work before you're letting people try to discourage what you're doing. Because even for me with my archery, I received tons of critique and shitty advice from people who never shot a bow, never made a bow, never even made an arrow. So like, that's sort of like my little go-to story. And now that I shoot, now that I know what I'm kind of doing for the most part, I'm pretty confident and comfortable with the practice and have more time dedicated to the practice than a lot of people out there who are control shows.
Yeah, well, I mean, walking the walk is really so important. I always even think about that term like miopamatsuin, the walking a good life, actually doing it is where the knowledge comes from. And, and I think too, like we have to be loud and proud and bold about the importance of our land-based connections, whether it's hunting, or whether it's even just gathering medicines and berries. It's all those land-based food procurement activities that I believe form the foundation of our identity as Indigenous peoples before language. You'll hear people say the language is the foundation. Nope. It's those land-based skills and relationships that are the foundation for the language to rely upon. Because when we cease to exercise those skills and practices, the language comes unraveled, and the language ceases to transfer from one generation to the next. And you'll notice that anybody or older people who are still fluent speakers, they were taught to speak as children from somebody who was very ecologically literate, who knew the land, knew the medicines, knew the animals, knew how to utilize it. And we haven't been transmitting the language ever since, because we're trying to learn it in scenarios outside of that life, that good life meal pamatsu, which is a land-based lifestyle. Yeah. So we have to put that back. When we begin to put that back, those other components of culture come back into place. Language, ceremony, kinship systems, all of that. But it's those land-based practices that have to be nurtured first of all.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I really like what you're saying here. And for me, people who I look up to, and even some of my mentors, are engaged in a land-based practice. Like, you look at strong language people who are working on language stuff, they're actually doing camps, they're actually avid hunters and fishermen, and you know, a lot of horse people in Plains Cree Nakota culture, you know, who know the language and maintain that practice. So they're actually tied to a practice to foster and motivate them. So it makes a lot of sense what you're saying here, having to, you know, connect to those land-based practices and get people out there, get people on the land to be able to keep life going, right? Literally keep life going, meopamatsu, and like living the good life and finding access points to that. Yeah, I really like what you're saying there, and you gave us a lot to think about and be mindful about, and I'm really looking forward to how our listeners respond to this episode. If people want to get a hold of you or find you online, or, you know, touch base with you, ask you a question outside of the podcast, how do they get a hold of you and find you?
Well, right now, just my email, which is philipbrass@outlook.com. There's just one L in Philip, or on Facebook. I have a website, but I haven't kept it up over the last year and a half of COVID, so it's kind of gone dormant. Just philipbrass.com.
Cool. Awesome. Any shout outs you want to give?
Shout out to just all of you who are, you know, interested in maintaining this way of life, and much respect to everybody. Much respect to you, Mylan, and the work that you do. And just wish you all safety out there on the land, and as we go into fall. I know the elk will be calling in about 6 weeks. I'm looking forward to that. Speaking of that, maybe we should give a shout out to Treaty Land Sharing Network people. If anybody's interested, look into the Treaty Land Sharing Network. It's something that was kind of born out of a conversation I had with Valerie Zink. She took that and ran with it with a number of other non-Indigenous women who have organized a number of non-Indigenous farmers, landowners, ranchers who, I think, you know, really they're trying to counter that message of no trespassing in Saskatchewan that really came out after the Charles Stanley trial. And yeah, we're just trying to change that narrative, you know, and build some, just recognizing Indigenous people's right of way on the land. You know, there's a lot of work to do in that regard. I know a lot of these settlers are very afraid to open up that door and to relinquish some of their power and control, but there's a few of them out there that would like to make shifts. And so that's, for any Indigenous harvesters and hunters listening, you know, look into the Treaty Land Sharing Network. It's taking off here in southern Saskatchewan. Perhaps that could be replicated in other territories. Just some people trying to do some good work in small ways where we are.
Yeah, totally. And they just had a gathering a couple days ago, and I'll link that up into the show notes so people could see the news article and get access to the group. But yeah, Valerie Zink, she's on our future guest list. I want to reach out to her and have a conversation about that model that she's promoting and getting people on board with.
Good stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I really wanted to have an introductory conversation, and, you know, our listeners out there, if you have any questions or comments or need clarification, don't be afraid to reach out to Philip or me. And yeah, we definitely want to have more episodes around, you know, accessing land safely, ethically, and providing those access points to our listeners who requested it. So yeah, thanks, Philip, for your time. I really appreciate it. I really like what you're doing. It's really good to see. And yeah, we'll have to connect soon and have conversations again in the future.
All right. Thanks, Mon.
Cool. Thanks, Philip.
Hey.
This episode was produced and mixed by Nicola Clausen and Mylan Tatusis, with additional administrative and production support from Daryl Lucero. If you like what we do, please like, subscribe, and share. You could find us on Facebook and Instagram at The Radical Narrative Podcast. If you wish to contact us, our website is www.radicalnarrative.com.